Okay, so let's begin. I want to first offer a few thanks. First of all, to all of you who are sticking it out for this last panel. It's been a really interesting and intensive experience up till now, so we understand that people may flag in their energy, and we're appreciative for your efforts to continue on. Secondly, to Rick Reese, of course, for his incredibly generous support for not only this particular event, but for the work of the center going forward, without which we couldn't do anything like what we are now in a position to do. And to Rachel for putting in so much incredible time, energy, and talent into organizing this really spectacularly successful event. This panel is going to be a little bit different than the other panels. We're all directors and fellows of the center, and we thought it would be useful to have a chance in real time to reflect on the events of today, the panel discussions that we've had. They've been filled with ideas and facts, concepts. We've learned a great deal about what the most salient issues are confronting national security practitioners in this interesting time. And so we're going to be all just reacting to what we've heard up till now. Let me begin by introducing the panelists. At the far end is Lisa Monaco, who is currently an adjunct professor of law here at NYU and a distinguished senior fellow at the Reese Center on Law and Security. As probably many of you know, she served for many years as assistant to President Obama for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. Prior to her White House appointment, she spent years in various positions at the DOJ, Department of Justice, including as Assistant Attorney General for National Security. Before that, she was a Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General and served for 3 years as Counsel and Chief of Staff to FBI Director Robert Mueller. And before that, she worked as an Assistant U.S. Attorney. She is the recipient of the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Service, the DOJ's highest honor, as well as the Edmund J. Randolph Award, which is awarded by the Attorney General in recognition of outstanding contributions to the DOJ's mission. On the opposite side, we have Tess Bridgman, who is a senior fellow also and visiting scholar at the Reese Center. She served as Special Assistant to President Obama, Associate Counsel to the President, and Deputy Legal Advisor to the National Security Council, where she advised on a full range of issues relating to national security and foreign policy of the United States. She previously served in the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Legal Advisor, where she was a special assistant to the legal advisor. And prior to that, she served as an attorney advisor in the Office of Political Military Affairs. And prior to that, I'll add, she was my student. She is currently a lecturer and affiliate at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation and a senior advisor at National Security Action. Now, our other two panelists, Ryan Goodman and Stephen Holmes, are both distinguished professors here at NYU Law School, and both are directors of the Reese Center on Law and Security. That's all I'll say about them, and I'll add, I'm David Golub. I'm also a professor here, less distinguished, and but also a director of the Reese Center. So with that, let's turn to the discussion. I thought it might be helpful to begin by asking actually a question of Lisa. One of our panelists remarked that the issue of terrorism and counterterrorism, it may be, looking forward, a smaller part of the national security program, a smaller part of what concerns national security practitioners than it has been in the past, well, say, since 9/11. That more important today are issues of global competition between leading powers, the United States, Russia, China, and so on. And I thought it would be interesting, especially in light of your experience in the White House, to reflect on that and let us know what your thoughts are.
Well, thanks very much, David. And I am going to play the role of I think, guest practitioner most recently on this panel. I do not have nearly the academic credentials that this crew has, so you'll take my comments in that spirit. I'm very honored to be on this panel with all of my fellow panelists, and I want to thank Rick very much for his support of the center and enabling me to have such a wonderful home post-government. The comments you made, David, you're referencing, I think, John Bellinger's comments this morning as part of the opening panel. And I should say, I've known John for going on 20 years now, when I was first in the Justice Department as counsel to Janet Reno, and he was in the criminal division. So I have the utmost respect for John, but I was quite struck. The context for his comments, for those of you who weren't here this morning, comes in the context of the discussion about kind of whither the global international liberal order, and what are we seeing in terms of trends. And John and Avril Haines and Jake Sullivan all made a series of comments. And in the context of that discussion, John Bellinger pointed to the fact that really what we're going to be needing going forward is a strategy to deal with the rise of Russia and China, and terrorism and cyber are smaller problems. So I was quite struck by that. I definitely agree with the need for a strategy on Russia and China, and we can get more into that. But I was struck by the comment that terrorism and cyber will be, quote unquote, smaller problems. And the additional context for this is the Trump administration's national security strategy. I think you see a reflection of this notion that going forward we need to be focusing on great power competition. That was also a theme in the National Defense Strategy that Secretary Mattis rolled out several months ago. And for the first time, you see the Defense Department talking about something other than terrorism as the chief threat and challenge that we face. My issue is not so much the ranking of top threats, but the characterization of terrorism and cyber as somehow smaller going forward in light of the upheaval in the global order. I actually take the counter view, which is to say our ability to address the terrorism threat, which continues to be diffuse, and discussions about the decline of ISIS, I think, are true insofar of it as a insurgent army, but it continues to be able to project power and radicalize and inspire individuals to do violence. So the challenge to address the terrorism threat, I think it's more complicated in a retreat to unilateralism and a retreat from multilateralism. Why do I say that? The tools that we need, and I say this having spent a lot of time on the, quote, small problem of terrorism during my time in the White House, the strategies that we need, the effective tactics that we need are really resident in the partners that we can work with. The safe havens for terrorists are in ungoverned spaces where we don't have a tremendous amount of reach or capability. We need to be building up capacity in partners to address the terrorism threat in places like Yemen and Libya and other places. So that does not come in a unilateral package. That comes in a cooperative multilateral package. That comes in a robust foreign aid package. So I think the terrorism challenge gets bigger and more complicated and more challenging in a unipolar world, or in a world where we're looking only at great power relations and not about and retreating from multilateral efforts. And the same is true vis-a-vis cyber. What we need, in my view, amongst a litany of things to improve cybersecurity, is the establishment of norms of behavior. And while there is a lot to be said for agreements between nations about what not to do, I think ultimately we will only succeed in making progress in cyber deterrence and in cybersecurity by establishing some agreement amongst the international community about the rules of the road in cyberspace. And for that, we need US leadership in global and multilateral institutions. So bottom line, not smaller, bigger, more complex when it comes to terrorism and cyber. And layered on, of course, is now the ascent of resurgent powers like China and Russia.
So I just want to piggyback on one part of that, which is the dearth of norms, multilaterally on cyber in particular, and the need for some kind of regime to be set up. And it kind of dovetails a little bit with what I was thinking about with the first panel, which was this question of, is law retreating and there's less law within this global order? But wearing a kind of a different hat, which is kind of the social science hat, of the ways in which norms, networks, and institutions do actually start to put order onto the ways in which different states and non-state actors operate. And those could be norms that are legitimated norms through legal institutions, but they don't have to be so purely legal. So the distinction between what is illegal, and then I guess Jake Sullivan started talking about the quasi-legal. Well, in the cyber realm, if we can even just get agreement among certain states about normative expectations within cyber, what is a use of force in cyber? What is a critical infrastructure that's almost like on a no strike list in cyber? And it doesn't have to be necessarily law, but then so much of what government lawyers are doing is applying quasi-law all the time. And I guess even for just my brief stint in government, so much of my time was being spent on application of executive orders and the president's policy guidance on use of force. And none of that was necessarily law or legally binding, but it required lawyers to interpret the meaning and the definition and the expectations. And so much at the international level, I think, can be set that way too. So I think there's a huge amount of room for lawyers, and there's unfortunately, a vast space that's currently ungoverned in cyber because it lacks these norms. I think that's an important part of how we think about global order. It's not just the law itself, but quasi-law.
Yeah, just a comment also on Lisa. I think I've been living in France for the last 2 years, and if you had a conference on national security in France, it would have been all about jihad, jihadism and so forth, and the Frenchmen in Syria and so forth, the 500 jihadis in prison in France. And I think it's important to distinguish terrorism and cyber, because cyber is an issue that everybody thinks is large, even whatever John said. But terrorism was not mentioned today. And when we began 16 years ago, this center, it was, of course, that's all we talked about. So I think it's a commentary. The fact that the discussion today did not mention the word is a commentary on an evolution of our national security environment, and it's requiring, that's why, one of the reasons we are rethinking how the Center on National Security should focus.
I can just jump in on the, still not on, too many mics. The role of lawyers question, because I think that's one that I've been reflecting on throughout the course of the day, and I think this has been a really incredible conference in terms of identifying the problem sets. And I do think we have come a pretty long way, given how momentous some of the shifts are that we're talking about, and getting some level of consensus on the problems, right? So I'll try to pick up a few and see if others disagree with me. I think, and this is largely stemming from the first panel, but certainly agreement we need to revitalize the global architecture of our institutions. They weren't always perfect, right? Some actors got left out from the beginning. There's a need to both invest in them as well as to explain what their functioning is, right? So that we have our expectations adjusted. I think there was agreement on that. Two, I think this was Avril Haines' great term, we need to deal with the domestic dysfunction that underpins some of these shifts we've been seeing, and the Congress panel drew that out. In some ways, the journalists drew it out in others. But in terms of, what are the incentives and the resources that Congress members and their staffers have to work from? And on the journalism panel, of course, we heard about the siloing of information, these things that are really preoccupying all of us in terms of the, and I'll use someone else's phrase here, the concentrated power of platform monopolies. Great phrase, but I think we all agree that the problem set has these both, and to pick up on something else Avril mentioned, this kind of collapsing of the international and the domestic drivers of some of the shifts that we're talking about, and we need to get used to thinking about both of these in tandem. Where I think lawyering is kind of comes in and is the most fun is in trying to create solution sets. And that's the hard part, and it's something that I think we don't spend as much time on, perhaps in our legal training, and then kind of in particular in settings where you don't have a rich group like this that can really kind of pull from both academic analysis and also practice. So this is, I think, the ideal setting to start to tease out some of the solution sets. And I think those are going to be twofold. There's process solutions that we need to deal with, right? And I think in the academy we might call the field of global administrative law something that we need to deal on. Others might call it institutional design. But a lot of what we heard in the first panel this morning is, how do we actually reinvigorate these institutions through legal mechanisms that will make them operate in a way that's more resilient, more effective, given our current geopolitics. And then separately, a whole set of substance questions, whether it's cyber counterterrorism, but also some of the things that our panelists were picking up on today that I don't think we've really crystallized in terms of kind of a number of the different areas that were being picked up on have kind of similar pathologies. So we turn to sanctions, for example, as the go-to tool for a number of the different problems that were discussed in the panel on Congress. What is our toolkit aside from sanctions? And I think Lisa picked up on this just now as well. How do we go about creating strategies that are kind of multilateralized enough to be sticky, particularly as U.S. influence is beginning to be erratic, or at least a variable, as I think Jake rightly put it. Another, kind of specific question that kind of came up here and there that I think is marries both substance and process. How do we create statutory frameworks that allow Congress to have the right incentives and, quite frankly, the political cover to exercise their constitutional role in an era where those incentives have been, quite frankly, the opposite? And a third is how do we create a dynamic regulatory framework for these platform monopolies? The kind of information questions that have been raised, and people say it's too hard to do. People say, Congress doesn't have the resources, the executive branch doesn't have the expertise. If we can do it for big banks, if we can do it in every other industry, surely there's a way to figure out how to do dynamic regulation of these platforms as well. And those kinds of solution sets, I think, are ones that this is the right environment to be trying to tease those out. So I'll leave it there for now.
Can I just comment on something that Stephen said? I think it's very worth reminding ourselves that you don't actually have to reach back to 9/11 to think about the terrorism problem. It's easy to forget, I think, with the day-to-day tweet storms and the constant focus on the domestic dysfunction, that it was the fall of 2015 when the Paris attacks happened. It was the March of 2016 that the Brussels attacks happened. It was the summer of 2016 when the Orlando massacre happened, and the fall of 2015, for San Bernardino, the massacre in San Bernardino. So that is not a long time ago, and yet we've gotten some distance, it seems, in our day-to-day focus on these issues. And I, for one, am not sanguine that we shouldn't be talking more about terrorism at a conference like this, because I think it will come roaring back, in part because the challenges, if I was on this panel a couple of years ago, the issue on the platform monopolies would have been about getting them to do more to take down radicalizing content. Over time, I would say the platform companies have done more, but it frankly has been eclipsed by the inability to address nation state and other malicious actors and abusers of platforms when it comes to disinformation. So I think it's worth pausing on Stephen's point that we have not commented until the 3 o'clock hour on terrorism. Quite striking.
So one observation about the 3 panels was that the first panel, the elephant in the room was the election in 2016 and the changes that have happened since then that are evulsive and that are confusing and that are uncertain in the direction that they're heading, whether they're temporary, whether they are really a reflection of longer-term trends, whether it's possible that in 2021 a reversal could happen. We could go back to a direction more similar to the direction we've been on in the past. And that was, I think, in many ways the focus at a kind of a general level of the conversation. In the second panel, I would put it as it was a kind of same as it ever was. That is, it was about separation of powers and the problems of congressional oversight, congressional involvement in the national security area, in areas where Congress has abdicated its constitutional powers, maybe it's acted even unconstitutionally, depending how you look at it, over a long course of many years and decades, and that the problems today are similar in some respects to what they've been before. We didn't talk about, I don't think anyone, except for maybe a couple of brief mentions, picked up on what was the title of the panel, which was about the midterm elections. So in that sense, that was where Donald Trump played a relatively in the background role in the discussion. The third panel there was a lot of discussion of what's changed, but a lot of what was discussed was actually what is the same as it's been before, or maybe in somewhat new circumstances with some new wrinkles, but not necessarily terribly different. And so as it does general observations about the 3 panels, and I wonder whether anyone has any thoughts about what the significance of these, let's just say, if we take the problematic as Donald Trump's emergence, the shift in American foreign policy, national security policy, how should the center think about its role with respect to, is the orientation on long-term trends, on these more classical problems in national security law? Even you could say terrorism might be a piece of that even at this stage. Or should we be focused on what's in front of us right now? What are the possibilities? What measures, as it were, if you want to call it such, emergency measures almost, ought to be taken in order to do something to prevent the worst outcomes that are on the horizon potentially? All right, I'll stop with those observations, but I wonder whether any thoughts about those. Yes, Stephen.
Well, I'm going to just try to, having listened today, distill a few points to describe what's unique about the present, because obviously we all feel that there's something different about today, and that are related to our national security difficulties. So one, and maybe Lisa and others would comment on this, one seems to be, it's not so much about the radicalism of the White House, of the president, but the question of incompetence. So it seems to be, and we saw this in the Istanbul murder case, the capacity of the government to respond coherently to an emergency seems to be vastly reduced. This has to do with, basically, this was a small emergency. It seems to me very probable, and it's related actually to the history of the center, because when the center began, one of our participants was Turki Faisal, who is Khashoggi's mentor. And it's very probable, it seems to me, that it's not just that Khashoggi was writing the Washington Post, but Khashoggi was a spokesman for resistance in Saudi Arabia to the Crown Prince. And he's sending a message, something like that. So this is a very dangerous thing happening in an ally. And do we have a capacity to respond to it? It took days. We're not telling lies. So this is a very, and I think if we have a repeat of what happened in the South China Sea with that ship that pulled in front of ours, and we had a terrible accident and 300 sailors were killed, Does this administration have the capacity to call someone up and calm them down and say, let's think about this? So that seems to me, in a way, the major national security issue today of this administration, its capacity to respond to an emergency we haven't had yet. And of course, maybe we can be lucky, but don't count on that. Another thing that seems very unusual is that not the congressional oversight process, but basically the system of presidential findings and presidential oversight of the agent of CIA and so forth is obviously in crisis if whenever the CIA gives a bit of Israeli intelligence to the president turns it over to Russia, who turns it over to Iran. So that's a problem. So in those circumstances, are the agencies going to share knowledge with the president? I don't have any insight. I would guess that there's a resistance to doing that. That's a very big change in something that we developed decades ago, and that's in crisis. There is the most amazing thing that the entire Republican national security establishment has been purged from Trump's party. And that's an amazing thing he's done. Most of them are urging people to vote for the other party and so on. So that's also a kind of, I don't even know how to adjust our minds to this, but that's very strange. And of course, it's related to the fact that our president is attacking the FBI, So how did national security agencies, and particularly the FBI, function? Are they going to be changed by this? But then my last point, I think, is in a way more important. This last panel I thought was wonderful, and it shows that the press is really doing its job. Congress is abdicating, more or less. But that discussion about agenda-driven information, saying, well, it's true, but maybe the person who gave it to us has a hidden agenda, and shouldn't we react to that? We are so far beyond that issue because the place we are is, even if it's true, it doesn't matter. That's our situation. And we have a president who thinks the only reason you tell the truth is because it's in your interest. And so I can lie because it's in my interest, and we're fighting each other. And Mueller is a Democrat. And I'm not obstructing justice. I'm just fighting back because basically there is no justice. It's just another faction. So this is a very radical understanding of our situation. That is, the truth, there may be a truth, but it doesn't matter. We won, as he said about Kavanaugh. We won, so truth doesn't matter. And what happens in that environment, that the press can be doing a wonderful job at revealing things that we want to know, we need to know, and it has no effect. So I think, this makes our moment today a unique one. And these are the kinds of things that we need to wrap our minds around, if possible. One other, just a word I heard today, and I wanted to clarify it a little bit. Polarization, because everyone talks, the public is polarized. Polarization means two things. Could mean that the two positions are very far apart. That's one way. The other, that the people hate each other. And actually, people hate each other when they're closer together, as you probably know from your family life. So I think we're in this situation of like this violent hatred and anger and discrediting, and the only reason you're saying that is you're my enemy. And if that's the environment we're working in, how do national security agencies function? Well, they can function by staying out, doing their jobs, keeping their head down, like Christopher Wray says. He just does his job. But still, it's a corrosive atmosphere in which to work.
So, all eyes looking at me. So I'll take up Stephen's first question about competence or incompetence. I mean, I tend to look at it this way, which is to say there is a vast, competence is varied from what I have seen. I'll just put it that way. And it is more about inability to exercise, or a rejection of exercising the levers of government in the way that we have set up norms and processes and procedures to do. Things like relying on the National Security Council process to actually bring together experts, civil servants, fact-based subject matter expertise on a problem, chew on it really hard, develop either consensus or a set of well-thought-through options up to the president. I think we have not seen that happening. The greatest example of that, of course, is the first iteration of the travel ban, et cetera, and then it came out in multiple different iterations. Of course, you know, if the third iteration of the travel ban had been the product of a process of the type I've just described, and that had been unleashed on, you know, February 1st of 2017, I think it would have largely stuck, as it now has stuck from the Supreme Court. So process could really have been their friend in that regard. And you can have different views as to what you think about that. But this is about not exercising the levers and norms of governance that their predecessors have. It is also about denigrating, so less about substantive competence than about denigrating the institutions that contain that competence. Things like the intelligence community, like the FBI and the Justice Department and career prosecutors and investigators. What's the practical effect of that? I mean, you know, I've sat on, frankly, many panels like this to talk about hang our heads about the decline of norms and institutions, which I believe is a real problem, but the practical impact of that is as follows. The institution of the intelligence community that is denigrated and does not feel trusted by customer number one, which is the president and the intelligence community speak. Well, what does that mean for the willingness of the men and women of the intelligence community to speak hard truth? Now, I have faith, having worked for 20 years with those men and women in the intelligence community, that they will continue to speak hard truths, but will they be in the room? Will their analysis be requested? Will it be part of the rigorous National Security Council process that I just mentioned, such that it actually gets into the debate, gets into the policy process? That is a practical question that I don't think we've got the answer to, and in fact, there's evidence to indicate that the answer is in the negative. The other practical import here is in the denigration of an institution that I grew up in and that I love, the Department of Justice. The practical impact of denigrating the work of the FBI is, yes, of course, in the immediate to kind of throw doubt on whatever the special counsel produces, but I think it's got a much longer term impact, and that is the likelihood and the willingness of everyday citizens to work with law enforcement, to actually share information with the FBI, to actually think, as they're sitting on a jury and a member of law enforcement or an FBI agent is a witness in that trial, well, should they trust what they say? And our system of law requires that we have some norms and respect around that process. So I worry about the practical impact of the destruction of these norms. And yes, it plays out in competence or incompetence, but I'm much more worried about the longer tail on this.
I think quite briefly, in terms of thinking about where we are in this moment, I do think that there are special problems that we're facing, and they include, so some of them are like external to the United States, but they're structural, like migration. I thought that was a puzzling omission in the first panel. They were talking about so many different problem sets, but never mentioned migration, which I think does explain some of the political pressure in Brexit, in Germany, in the United States, and it makes Trump more like a symptom than a cause. And then I think a second structural problem is what we've gone over time and again, and the last panel did it very well in terms of the social organization of information, the transmission of information, the absence of trusted intermediaries, the ability for certain channels of information to be so direct and there's no mediation. So that might include Trump using it in his ability to communicate directly with people, and then they filter out all kinds of opposing viewpoints, but somebody else will take that over next time. So I think those are things that are with us, and even if we take a different path in 2020, what Jake Sullivan said, I think we might just take another path right back in 2024, because those are pressing structural issues that we have to face. And I think, unfortunately, the politics of fear and the politics of distrust are what now operate in those domains, and that's really what's kind of drawing us off the cliff, I think.
Just to briefly pick up on that, I completely agree, and I think that the reason that the 2016 election was maybe the sleeping elephant in the first panel is because we did see agreement that the dysfunctions and the geopolitical shifts that we were discussing did not begin with Trump, that it is more a symptom, whether it exacerbates and accelerates some of those trends. Of course, that's something that we can debate, and I think the answer is yes, but they didn't begin in 2016. I completely agree that what is new is this way of kind of, right, national interest is always socially and politically constructed, but this way of constructing it in a way that makes the U.S. an erratic variable, even on some of the things that we've held to be most foundational. And to me, the most important of all of those is the rejection of the concept of truth. And I think much as Ryan just said, I think the kind of counterpoint to that for me has to not just be the media, but Congress. And I think the place where I have both the most cause for concern, but also the most hope, to the extent we actually see a shift here, comes from, it might have been Luke Murray who was mentioning this, but there is this ability to set the narrative tone on these issues of importance. And to the extent we see any bipartisan leadership that is able to set the narrative tone, particularly on the concept of objective truth and some of these national security issues that we're dealing with, that is the one thing that over time I think we need. I think it's it's not just it's not sufficient, but I think it's necessary to start shifting the tone back again.
So another part of the discussion, I think both the first and the second, to some extent, panel, was about treaties and treaty power. And treaties are one core area where where the concept is both about how the international order is organized, but also subject to regulation at the domestic level in terms at least of the procedures through which treaties are entered. And there was a lot of discussion about how, well, treaties are dead, the Senate won't approve treaties anymore, or only in very particularly trivial cases. What the prospects are for that changing are rather uncertain. That other mechanisms for creating international cooperation on the basis of agreement are being utilized more and more, especially Jake Sullivan was talking about the non-bonding commitment, the political commitment as a means of entering into these very important, elaborate, sometimes incredibly lengthy and precise international agreements, but that have written at the bottom line, and this is not legally binding under international law, or they don't have at the bottom, but there's a State Department lawyer who's making sure that there's no other language that could suggest the contrary in the agreement. And I was struck by how comfortable all the panelists were. Maybe this is a reflection of the lawyer in me, but how comfortable they were with these alternatives as constitutionally unproblematic in the United States under the Constitution that we know thus far. The Constitution seemed like it almost played a kind of, it's a bit of an obstruction, and it can be got around if it's ignored. I'm making those points as provocatively as I can. So I'm wondering, these things are moving in contrary motion in some way. Need for greater forms of international cooperation, but for less accountable forms, if you want. At least we would say that in constitutional terms. Whether a political scientist would agree with that assessment might be another question. But we move away from systems where Congress or the Senate are involved in the undertaking of major commitments on behalf of the United States to one where the president is all-powerful. What Hamilton would have condemned as not only imprudent, but out of the question when writing the Federalist Papers. And I wonder, anyway, whether anybody has any reflections on that aspect of the panel discussions. Yeah.
True to my caveat at the beginning, I'll take a little bit different tack on this, which is to say, a lot of ink has been spilled over the last couple of years about the growth of the unitary executive, the arrogation of power to the executive to do a whole number of things, whether it's executive orders or some of the things that we talked about this morning. And I have to credit Jack Goldsmith with this comment, which is to say, if you go down the list of things that President Trump has now pulled the United States out of, and it's a lengthy list, much of which was discussed this morning, so I won't go through it, all done without so much as a peep, by and large, by Congress, right? And so there's been this kind of steady ability of the executive not only to arrogate power to itself, but to also blithely say unilaterally, I'm going to pull the United States out of these agreements. And what is the impact of that on our ability to be a force in the world? So I'll get around to your question, which is I land on the side of I'm less troubled, unsurprisingly, by the agreements or the plans of action. That really actually is the phrase, right? Plan of action that some of these US-led efforts have been, because frankly, to solve some of the really big, hard, emergent, and urgent problems, you need that leadership. And you frankly don't have the luxury to, if we had to try and get a treaty through the Senate to muster France and the UK to join with us to each pick a country in West Africa to staunch the Ebola spread, we would have seen a very different reaction and a very different result. But instead, what you had was US leadership, both at the UN, in the WHO, but frankly, just leadership from the United States at the presidential level. And I can tell you, because I was in those meetings every morning where he said, what are we doing and do I need to make a call? And he is the one, President Obama is the one, who got the leaders of France and the UK to dedicate resources to make sure that we stop the spread of Ebola in West Africa. So, that kind of political power and influence and capability to bring US leadership to problems like that, I think you have to be able to have that flexibility. So I'm less troubled by some of these informal agreements.
So just a brief point, which is that there's a difference between the cooperation over Ebola and the Iran nuclear deal,
Sure,
or the Paris agreement on climate change. I don't think even under traditional conceptions of executive power and congressional or senatorial power, the Ebola cooperation, which doesn't really take the form of an international agreement, but some kind of informal arrangement common in the past, is quite the same. But I don't mean to push the point. I think your point can be made about the other cases as well. After all, climate change is a pressing issue, and it'd be impossible to deal with through the Senate mechanism. So
The better example, sticking with the pandemic response, is the Global Health Security Agreement, right? Which is a multilateral agreement that some 50 countries have now signed up to, but has now been defunded in the last year or so, to raise standards for surveillance of the appearance of pandemics in other countries. So those types of, I think my point is simply, those types of agreements that don't have the force of law, but rely on the force of leadership as opposed to the force of law, are the things that I think we're going to need to rely on more and more.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to your question by recalling what Jake said about 1945 and 1989, where was the origin of the liberal international order that someone in Iowa didn't like. Now, in a way, the major impulse in the post-World War II order was to try to create a system that would prevent the remilitarization of German and Japanese nationalism, including not allowing them to have nuclear weapons by giving them nuclear umbrellas. It was NATO and the Japanese treaty. And of course, to this, when our president is reminded of that, he says, but the Japanese and Germans are selling us cars and luxury cars, and I want to get them rid. So as opposed to thinking, so we have a president who doesn't seem to think about this aspect of our national security environment. And it could be his personal idiosyncrasy. On the other hand, NATO was created in order to resist the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist. So it can be a treaty, all you want, treaty, it's rather bound, but it can't possibly resist, can't possibly keep its resilience in a vacuum where the enemy against which it was created disappears. So treaties, but I think this is why 89 is strange. In 89, we felt suddenly free. We could spread our values everywhere, including on the back of an Abrams tank in some cases. But, and on the other hand, why would anyone join with us? Because that alliance worked because, as it did in the early days, I mean, Bush and Baker got a big alliance to go against Saddam because everyone felt they had a stake in it. And in 2003, they didn't feel that way. So this is a question, what's a treaty, what's an alliance? It has to do with the purposes of the time, which have changed so radically that I think, not to say that constitutional theorists of treaties don't have something to add, but this is an aspect, I mean, you have to think about it in the context of global, the evolution of geopolitics.
So I'm caught between my former professor and my former boss, and I'm gonna go with my former boss on this one, actually, because I think I would agree that just context matters for these types of agreements and arrangements. Of course, NATO has to be binding. The JCPOA didn't have to be because it was about sequencing and incentives. And at the end of the day, I'm not bothered by the constitutional question because Congress gave us waivers, we used them. And that was the deal. They voted on whether they would continue to allow us to use the waivers, and that didn't succeed. So they found a mechanism, right, that mirrored the structure that we created on the international plane. And I think that's sufficient. What I lose sleep at night over is the constitutional question about withdrawal from treaties. And I think the problem of the U.S. leadership having become so erratic that it can't be trusted, and back to the point, would we be able to trust it even should things change in 2020 significantly, I think is the bigger issue going forward. I'm more worried about what happens on the international plane when the U.S. can no longer enter into arrangements as a trusted partner than I am about what we're going to do with a Congress that has taken it upon itself to politicize treaties to such an extent that it's not going to be a reliable partner in the treaty-making process. Although I take your point that it would be a better world if they did participate.
Of course, the same can be said about war and many other areas of national security. And there is a deep tension between being very concerned about the president terminating treaties on his own authority and his not being concerned about his making very, very broad international agreements on his own authority, so that these principles have a way of biting in both directions. And of course, everybody wants to have it both ways.
I would simply argue for upholding the norm that agreements entered into by prior administrations are upheld by, that's how I get off the horn of that dilemma.
Yeah. So we only have a few more minutes. Okay. Continuing on the treaty line a little bit, I was also struck by the discussion of the Bricker Amendment, and I thought it was worth just pointing out. I can't remember exactly who raised the Bricker Amendment point. It may have been Jake Sullivan, or maybe it was John Bellinger. Yeah. And what a monumental event that effort to amend the Constitution was, and how threatening it was perceived to the capacity of the United States to engage productively in international cooperative relations. Everybody may not be aware that there's a strong likelihood that the Supreme Court today, or soon, when the next case presents itself, will in fact enact as the constitutional law of the United States what the Bricker Amendment was actually designed to accomplish. And so through the very process of constitutional interpretation, we may be ending up in that place which also puts more pressure, again, on using other kinds of arrangements. Anyone has a comment? Do we want to have questions? Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Yeah.
I find that I think there's a definitional problem, vagaries or even a defect. The rule of law in a nation state is very different from the rule of law in international matters. Laws in a nation can be enforced by the power of that nation. Laws on an international basis can only be enforced by the cooperation of the parties as a norm. So we undervalue the term norm in this discussion, and we confuse the definition of law on an international scale with the definition of law on a national scale. And so treaties and such are much more in the nature of norms, because at any time a country can back away from a treaty. So I think that if we define that in that more rigorous way, we see that norms are more important, that the violation of these norms is very important, and you then have kind of a different way of looking at these things.
Briefly, so who enforces the rule that Congress has the power to declare war, not the president? Who enforces the rule that treaties are to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, not by the president entering into them on his own authority? Where's the army that enforces those rules?
Our courts do.
Well, they don't have an army, so why do we
That's
listen to
right.
the court? So that is
What
constitutional
enforces
law.
those are
But
norms.
constitutional law and international law have a lot in common. That is, they both survive. I mean, I'm going with your general point, but I'm applying it further. I'm extending it to constitutional law. They depend on norms for their enforcement. They aren't enforced through an army or a police force or anything else. To the extent that they are enforced that way, it's because of the underlying norms that stand behind them.
That it's true that norms are ultimately an important part of the enforcement of the Constitution and all the rest. But there is significant enforcement power at the nation-state level that does not exist at the international level. And so you have to elevate the utility of norms on an international level and even on the domestic level, because our consensus government, which we had up until recently, was a norm that permitted us to govern more effectively than the polarization does now. So norms are a big part of what we're doing and how we're operating. I think what's important is to note the limits of power that one has, so that, for example, the president doesn't have to enforce any domestic law. He can say, I deem it unconstitutional, I'm not going to enforce it. And as you say, the courts do not have an army to force him to do that. Yeah, norms are important, but so is enforcement power. And we're underplaying that. We're not sufficiently distinguishing between how an international treaty works and how a domestic law works.
I think the norm is we shouldn't impose
Yes,
more on the audience.
following an important norm that my colleague has just pointed out, we're going to end the session now, and thank you all for coming.